In late 2025 and into early 2026, Iran was absolutely rocked by some of the most intense protests the country had seen since the 1979 revolution. What started out as a cry against a failing economy, well, it quickly spiraled into a full-blown political uprising, and it pulled the entire world right to the edge of a major conflict. So let's get into exactly how this crisis unfolded. To really understand the chaos that followed, you have to first understand the silence. Because before the full story ever got out, the lights, digitally speaking anyway, were completely switched off. On January 8th, 2026, the Iranian government hit the kill switch, a nationwide internet and telephone blackout. And make no mistake, this wasn't some technical glitch. This was a deliberate move, a digital curtain pulled across a nation of 88 million people, setting a very dark stage for what was about to happen next. So, with the world effectively blinded, unable to see in, the regime's response to the protests turned absolutely brutal. And the warnings started coming almost immediately. Just a single day after the blackout, Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi voiced the international community's deepest fear, that this wasn't just a shutdown, it was the cover for a planned massacre happening in the shadows. And those fears were completely justified. Even with the shutdown, bits and pieces of information started to leak out. Eyewitnesses were reporting snipers on rooftops, security forces firing live rounds directly into crowds, horrific stories of hundreds of bodies just lying in the streets. Some of the most chilling testimonies described security forces finishing off wounded protesters with military-grade bullets, specifically to the head and neck. The blackout did its job perfectly. It created total confusion. It became nearly impossible to get a real death toll. The estimates from different human rights groups and news outlets were all over the place, from a verified minimum of around 3,400 to some activist groups estimating as high as 20,000. The truth itself became a casualty of this information war. So what lit this fuse in the first place? To really get the protests, we've got to rewind and look at the economic desperation that pushed so many Iranians right to their breaking point. This timeline really shows you how fast everything went downhill. It all started in September 2025, when these crippling UN sanctions were snapped back into place. By the end of the year, the national currency, the rial, had just completely tanked. Then inflation went through the roof. By December 28th, the merchants in Tehran's bazaars, the historical heart of Iran's economy, they just couldn't take it anymore. And that's when the protest kicked off. And this right here, this simple chart, tells you everything you need to know. The cost of living was exploding by over 52%. At the same time, the government was proposing a wage increase of only 20%. I mean, for the average family, that isn't a gap, it's a canyon. Their ability to buy even basic goods was just evaporating before their eyes. This quote from Iran's president at the time is just so revealing. It's a blunt admission from the very top that they had no answers. The government was broke. They literally couldn't afford to help their own people weather the storm. So, when you're faced with an economic crisis you can't solve and streets filling with angry people, what do? Well, the protests quickly went from being about money to being about overthrowing the government. And the state responded not with solutions, but with an iron fist. You can actually track how radical the movement became just by listening to the slogans they were chanting. It started with a general death to the dictator. Soon, that became a direct challenge to the supreme leader himself, with chants of death to Khamenei. Then, the focus turned outward, rejecting the regime's foreign wars. And, surprisingly, it even looked backward, with this revival of monarchist calls for the return of the old dynasty. The regime's response was a clear, multi-step campaign of suppression. You had direct orders to use live ammunition. You had mass arrests with thousands swept up, and of course, a state propaganda campaign. But honestly, the most chilling tactic was the raids on hospitals. Armed forces reportedly went in and seized the wounded right from their beds, making sure they couldn't become living symbols of the resistance. Now, a crisis this big doesn't just stay within a country's borders. As the violence got worse, the situation inside Iran quickly spiraled into a global geopolitical flashpoint. Just as the protests were really picking up steam, the US president issued this incredibly stark warning on January 2nd. That phrase, locked and loaded, it instantly raised the stakes, signaling that direct American military intervention was suddenly on the table. And he didn't just stop there. 11 days later, he sent a direct message to the protesters themselves, promising that help is on its way. Now, whether that was a real promise or just a bluff, it poured gasoline on an already raging fire and basically forced nations around the world to start picking sides. And this wasn't just talk, right? Things started to happen on the ground. U.S. aircraft carriers began moving toward the region. Iran fired back, threatening its own neighbors who host American bases. The U.S. and U.K. started pulling some personnel out, and countries like India were telling their citizens to leave Iran immediately. The whole world was starting to brace for impact. This crisis really just laid bare the geopolitical fault lines. On one side, you had the US and the big European powers, all united in enforcing sanctions and condemning the violence. And on the other side, you had Russia and China challenging those sanctions and signaling their continued support for the Iranian government. It was creating this incredibly tense global standoff. So by the middle of January 2026, the situation inside Iran was just unbelievably fragile. The regime's usual methods of control were failing, and they were facing a population that, maybe for the first time in a generation, seemed to have completely lost its fear of the state's violence. And that all leads us to the final, really critical question. What happens next? What happens when a people's desperation finally becomes stronger than their fear, and the world's great powers start drawing battle lines? The events of early 2026 left the future of Iran, and really the stability of the entire region, just hanging in the balance.